coming tonight to celebrate this month's publication of A Murder on the Hill, culminating a long, there's many O's in that word, long research, writing, and production process. I'm really delighted to be here tonight. This is my 11th published book now, and it's always a special moment to see a new book connect with its audience, so I'm very excited about that. Thank you also to Majors and Quinn for their hospitality tonight. So I'm going to begin by answering the question I get most often. How did I get interested in the Ruth Munson case? Well, I learned about the Ruth Munson case while reading Larry Millett's excellent book, Lost Twin Cities, which was turned into a public television program. Millett included a history of the Aberdeen Hotel, which you'll hear about shortly, and he noted it was the site of the Ruth Munson murder, and that, quoting now, her murder was never solved. Well, as a journalist who often did features, that phrase caught my attention, and I decided to do a feature about the case. What I learned quickly was that the case was largely forgotten and nothing significant had ever been written about it, which meant that original research in primary resources was necessary, and that awakened the historian in me because I am a college history major and have written 7 nonfiction books. What I soon learned about the case was that nothing had ever been done, and as I moved along, whatever fantasy I might have had about entertaining solving the case was a fiction. But in my research, I contacted the St. Paul Police Department, which graciously made the case file 33436 available, and down the rabbit hole I went. I started with interest in this book 20 years ago, but the last 3 years are when I have worked really hard on it. My mission soon became not solving the case, but trying to figure out why the case was never solved. And the answers to that question, why wasn't the case ever solved, became the book. So, although only my name appears on the cover, this book wouldn't be possible without the contribution of many people. For the full list of those who helped make this book a reality, please read the acknowledgments at the end, but I do want to mention several people tonight. First, I want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society Press for recognizing that this story represents part of Minnesota history, be it a true crime story. It's a story where the whole is somehow greater than the sum of its parts. I want to thank all the press staff, especially my editor, Ann Regan, whose belief in the story and her editorial wisdom and graceful touch are reflected on every page. And I want to thank many men and women, past and present, at the St. Paul Police Department. In particular, thanks to Ed Steenberg, Deputy Chief, who's now retired. He's president of the St. Paul Police Historical Society, and he provided biographic information about the more than 100 officers who filed reports on the case. He also answered many questions for me about the department, large and small, and he did so efficiently and cheerfully. I also want to thank Sergeant Mike Ernster, who's the public information officer at the police department now, for his assistance during the editing process and the production process, where we were rooting out some of the pictures that you see. And finally, I want to thank my family, and especially my wife, Kate, who's with us tonight. Over the past 2 years, all of my family accepted Ruth Munson as a holiday guest in our house and to tag along on our family vacations that ranged geographically from Hawaii to Croatia, with many points in between. So, now, to whet your appetite, I'm going to read 2 selections from chapter 1 here tonight. And you may notice that I'm not actually holding the book in my hands. good readers write prompts for themselves there, and there's absolutely no reason to ruin a perfectly good copy of the book that somebody could buy by writing a bunch of stuff in it. So I'm reading from copies, but be assured that the words that I read are those from the book. Another thing I learned when I started getting ready for this is that this is a book that was written to be read, not read out loud. There's lots of hard, slow places in this, so I'm glad that we're among friends here, and if I stumble, we'll circle the block and pick up where we left off. So with that, here we go from chapter 1. St. Paul's, Ramsey Hill neighborhood, December 9th, 1937, 4:45 a.m. Darkness. To save money during these tough Depression years, the city turned off the streetlights at 2:30 a.m. and they would not come on again until 5. On the southwest corner of Dayton Avenue and Virginia Street, right next to the vacant Aberdeen Hotel, several paper boys gathered under the unlit streetlight and shivered in the near-zero temperatures. The boys waited with growing impatience for the arrival of the St. Paul Pioneer Press's route driver, Harold Lewis, who always delivered their copies to this corner at 4:45. On this frigid morning, Lewis was running late. Once they received their papers, the paper boys would fan out into the dark streets to deliver the latest news to their faithful subscribers. At this early hour, the streets of Minnesota's capital city were quiet. Only the paper boys and the hardiest of souls were out. The men and women who had dressed up and gone out the night before to forget their troubles through a night of drinking, dancing, and, hopefully, romance, had either met with good fortune or straggled home during the night's wee dark hours and crawled into bed. Those men and women facing a new day's work were still tucked warmly in their beds. Much to the boys' annoyance, Lewis did not arrive with their papers until almost 5:30 a.m. The boys quickly loaded their papers into their shoulder bags and set out. Paper boy Herman Corosets on his route passed by the hulking shadow of the Aberdeen Hotel twice, once by the hotel's front entrance at 370 Dayton Avenue, and later past the rear of the building, which faced Selby Avenue. In his haste to deliver his papers, return home, and get ready for school at Mechanic Arts High School, the 17-year-old paper boy noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Stephen Westbrook, on his delivery route, passed the east side of the Aberdeen on Virginia Street twice, once at the beginning of his route and once at the end. On the second trip by the hotel, he noticed something odd about the iron gates in the hotel's backyard garden that opened onto Virginia Street. If I'm not mistaken, the 18-year-old Westbrook recalled, other mornings when I come by here, the gates are wired shut, but this particular morning it seems that they were open when I went by. I can't say positively. The open gates were noticed by another resident out at this early hour. Mrs. L. Bradbury left her apartment at 207 Virginia every morning at precisely 5:45 a.m. and walked south, crossing Dayton on her way towards Selby, where she caught the streetcar to work. This morning, when she passed the hotel, she also noticed that the iron gates were open. As the paper boys finished up their deliveries, the lights began to wink on in the houses and apartment buildings. Early risers beginning the workday. Among the winking lights were those of Mrs. Nellie McKernan in the Dakota Apartments, number 5, at 370 Selby Avenue. Mrs. McKernan's daughter, Margaret, was also up at this early hour because she had to go to work. At 6:45 a.m., when Margaret McKernan started to lower the shades so she could dress for work, she noticed what appeared to be a fire burning in the windows of the Aberdeen Hotel. The 8-story structure towered above the buildings lining the north side of their street. It took several minutes for mother and daughter to convince themselves that the vacant hotel was really on fire. Mrs. McKernan then called the fire department. A dozen blocks to the north, the fire alarm rang at Station 9 at 6:59 a.m. The station stood on the corner of Edmond Avenue and Marion Street in the heart of Frogtown, one of the city's working-class neighborhoods. In a swirl of well-paced maneuvers, the firemen quickly donned their fire gear and took their positions on Engine 9 and Truck 1. The two rigs rolled out into the darkness, racing south, crossing University Avenue, Rondo Avenue, and Marshall Avenue, then reaching the Aberdeen. Someone had turned in a second alarm, bringing 3 additional engine companies and 3 hook and ladder companies to the scene. That the Aberdeen was on fire came as no great surprise to anyone familiar with the building. The once luxurious hotel had stood empty and forlorn for 11 years, making it a likely destination for vagrants seeking shelter or scavengers scrounging for materials they could strip for the rooms and resell. The Aberdeen was shaped like the letter U, its broad base facing Dayton Avenue. 2 wings extended to the south, one bordering Virginia Street on the east side, the other on the western avenue side of the building. A single-story brick areaway connected the 2 wings. Adjoining the west wing, an annex that served as the hotel's laundry shared its west wall with Dayton Avenue garage. On the south end of the west wing, a 1-story brick boiler room jutted out into the neglected gardens at the rear of the property. The fire crews quickly determined that the fire was burning on the 2nd floor of the Aberdeen's west wing. Simultaneously, several crews broke into the building at various entrances with axes and picks. Firemen used a door ramp to break in the front door that faced Dayton Avenue. Though locked securely with a padlock, the doors actually were not closed tightly. The firemen made their way to the 2nd floor and raised several windows by hand. Elsewhere, a crew from Hook and Ladder Company Number 1 raised ladders against the outside wall of the boiler room and on the building's south side. Once on its flat roof, Ladder 1's Captain J. Giles took the iron fire escape up to the first landing, where he broke a glass window with an axe to gain entry onto the 2nd floor. Captain Bickle of Ladder 9 raised a ladder to the roof of the areaway between the east and west wings and entered a 2nd floor window through a 2nd floor room through a raised window. The only light inside the hotel came from the orange flames which had already engulfed the 2nd floor hallway and were spreading through doorways into adjoining rooms. Ladder 1's G. Morgan helped firemen from engines 8 and 3 feed lines into the hallway to pour water on the intense flames as they consumed the flooring and licked at the wainscoting. The water gushing from the fire hoses and the intense flames added steam to the hot, smoky air. It was hard to see and hard to hear the firemen's shouts. Other lines were brought in to help beat down the flames, and the firemen soon began to gain the upper hand, tearing the smoldering wood apart with axes and pikes. Engine 9's Captain William Davenport and fireman Joseph Harris attempted to enter a large room off the hall to help extinguish the flames. In the dim light, amidst all the smoke and commotion, Harris made a startling discovery on the hallway's wet, debris-strewn floor. "There's a body here!" Harris's shout no doubt sent a shiver through everyone who could hear it. The Aberdeen was no longer just the scene of a fire. It was now the scene of at least one fatality. Who was it? What happened? Were there more victims in the debris? Along with the smoke and soot, the possibility that a crime had been committed suddenly permeated the air. This was beyond the fire department's boundaries. The discovery of a body required immediate police presence. Now, from the moment that the firemen realized that police presence is required, several things happened that I want to summarize briefly and then continue on with the end of the chapter. First, 2 patrolmen who were outside on Dayton Avenue doing traffic duty were summoned inside. They, in turn, notified police headquarters at the Public Safety Building in downtown. Veteran detectives Boyd Carrier and Frank Kennedy, remember those names, are dispatched to the Aberdeen to begin an investigation. Police criminologist Dr. John B. Dalton is also sent to the scene. The Ramsey County coroner is notified. The assistant coroner, Otto Bundy, soon arrives at the scene. Next to the burned body, the detectives find a key ring containing 5 keys and the remains of other personal effects. And preparations begin to transfer the body to the Ramsey County morgue. And for you folks from St. Paul, at that time the Ramsey County morgue was just down over the hill from the St. Paul Public Library. So down where the parking lot is for the Science Museum, it's down in that general area. Okay, so we pick up with the chapter again. The assistant coroner and Dr. Dalton would accompany the body to the morgue, leaving detectives Carrier and Kennedy at the scene to take stock of the circumstances that would form the foundation for the investigation that loomed before the St. Paul Police Department. The circumstances were indeed grim. A charred body with severe head and chest wounds that may have been inflicted by an unknown assailant or assailants, or inadvertently caused post-mortem by a firefighter working with an axe or a pike. A crime scene that had been badly compromised, not just where the victim was found, but in other parts of the building. Firemen had broken into the building at various entrances, poured water on the flames, and tromped through the hallways, disturbing whatever dust may have caught incriminating footprints. The fragments of clothing they found suggested the victim was a woman. The purposeful removal of her clothing from her body suggested that she had been sexually assaulted. Her personal effects were all but destroyed by the fire. The fire was most likely intentionally set to conceal what? If the fire had not been discovered so quickly, the victim's body most certainly would have burned to ashes, and the woman would at best have been forever listed as a missing person, leaving loved ones to grieve in a vacuum. There was not much to go on, but investigators needed to make a positive identification and start solving what appeared to be a murder perpetrated in the Aberdeen. Or perhaps the woman had been slain elsewhere late at night and the body brought here and the hotel set on fire to cover up the crime. The key ring with its 5 keys was on its way to the morgue with the body and other personal effects. Seeking out the locks that those keys fit seemed like the most productive place to begin. In confronting these circumstances, Detective Carrier and Kennedy were addressing what they could see before them and how what they saw might impact the standard procedures of the pending investigation. But other circumstances that would complicate the investigation extended far beyond what lay before the detectives' eyes, encompassing both the city's history and that of the Ramsey Hill neighborhood where the Aberdeen Hotel stood. These complicating circumstances included a near decade-long financial depression and indeed the St. Paul Police Department's own dark legacy of corruption. So, to learn about these complicated circumstances and what happens next, buy the book and turn to chapter 2. Now, in terms of prepared remarks, I'll end by answering a question that I asked myself many times somewhere down that rabbit hole I mentioned a little while ago. What is significant about a case that slipped into obscurity over the course of decades? Why study this case now after all these years? Well, the answer is embedded in the social themes that emerged during my research. Woven within this mystery, there was the vulnerability of women, economic insecurity, mistrust of the police, police reform, race, and racism. These themes sound familiar to you? Again, reading from the book. This case is a snapshot in time that reminds us that the issues we struggle with today, and I'll pause and name them again, the vulnerability of women, economic insecurity, mistrust of the police, police reform, race, and racism. They have plagued us for centuries. Studying the Ruth Munson murder case offers us an opportunity to examine the gears of our society, large and small, and to see how one gear turns another, which turns yet another, eventually leading to an encounter that results in a criminal act. At the same time, all these turning gears influence investigators' ability to solve the crime. Understanding how and why these gears turn helps us make new progress toward, as the quote, Constitution preamble says, a more perfect union where everyone, regardless of who they are, feels free to search for their room on the hill. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have. Yes?
Did they have any leads at all with what happened to this woman?
Yes, they had many leads. I was able to have access to the actual police files, and I eventually worked out an arrangement where I got copies of everything, which was a full file drawer. There were 500 reports filed about this case, 120 statements that were taken by witnesses or suspects. And through all of that, numerous theories were identified, and I'll speak about that more in just a second. But they struggled to do, and when you read part two, this book has two parts. Part one recreates the investigation in real time, in the beginning, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, eventually year by year. And it covers, the file covers from 1937 to 1953 was the last entry into the file. Now, how many Law and Order fans here?
Well,
Yeah,
I watch a lot of crime.
Y'all know what they do. The detectives stand around, they give theories all the time. Well, I have the opposite with this book. The investigators wrote down the facts, they didn't write down their theories. But the newspapers were more than happy to speculate, and sometimes they quoted officers, and sometimes they speculated that it was probably their own makeup. So I had exactly the opposite. I had no theories to work with, but lots of reports, whereas on TV they have lots, no reports. Nobody ever writes a report, but they all have lots of theories.
Any indictments?
I'll let you find that out.
Okay, and I will buy the book, so.
Yes.
How was there a lot of publicity surrounding the murder at the time it happened?
This was a sensational case. It was the OJ case of its time, pretty much, that it was in the headlines for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. So for at least 3 months it was in the paper almost every day. In addition to the police files, I used a lot of public records, and I read hundreds of articles that appeared in the 6 daily newspapers that served Minneapolis and St. Paul at that time, and Minneapolis covered this case too. They connected it with an unsolved murder case here in Minneapolis. Plus there have been other cases that always evoked this case. So.
Was it of interest nationally or just locally, pretty much?
I think it might have had some regional interest. One of the things I planned to do, and I never caught around to it, was survey papers like in Chicago or St. Louis to see whether they picked it up. It was a pretty sensational thing. And they always referred to it as the charred body or the torch murder. That was the big phrase that they used. So if you think the press is very happy to really pour on the sensationalism, then now they're equally skilled in doing it then.
Over the course of the investigation, did the same group of police and investigators, did they kind of stay on this thing over a long period of time? Or did they get new people come on board to kind of give it new life?
Both. Detectives Carrier and Kennedy, which I said remember these names, I think they filed 60-some reports, just that team. They had another guy on their team, and they filed about 15 or 20, and then they filed individual reports, and they filed reports with other officers. So they filed 100 reports probably between them.
Has your book evoked any interest from some of these television shows, current television shows that are?
It just came
Cold
out
Case
on the
File?
2nd, so it's pretty new. Ask me that question in 6 months and I'll be able to answer it better.
Do you see a possibility of that at this juncture?
They always like to have cases that are solved. This case isn't solved, so, and that says, it says that in the very beginning. My reason for writing the book was to figure out why it wasn't solved.
Does the book talk about the victim and her life and
As much
She
as
wa-
I could find out, and the police did not spend very much time investigating her early life. They were really concerned about her life in St. Paul. She came here from Grantsburg, Wisconsin in 1929, and when the crime occurred in 1937, she'd been here 8 years, and they focused on that time period in her life. Yes,
How old was she?
she was 31 when
Okay.
she died. So she was born on March 13th, 1906. And I always felt I had a good connection with her because my birthday's the next day.
Hey, Roger.
Yes.
Did you pick up a sense of the evolution of police procedures over the course of, 15 years that they tried to solve it? I mean, I gotta believe it was pretty crude, the tools they had, and
In the extenuating circumstances, you will read about where the big break in police work occurred, and it occurred about several years before. This is information that's been kicking around in the public for a long time, so I'm not doing too much of this for you. But the police department was very corrupt during the gangster era. Police officers tipped off gangsters that raids were coming. They were engaged in gambling and prostitution themselves, and you'll be able to read a summary of that. If you want to know more about the corruption, read Paul McAfee's excellent book, John Dillinger's Slept Here, because he does the definitive treatment of that. But the people who handled this investigation were reformers of the police department, and so they had cleaned up to the best of their ability the corruption that was there. And forensics didn't exist to the extent that they do now, but they had some good things in addition to just good thinking, common sense, and investigative work. They had things, but the crime scene was destroyed, so they didn't have very much opportunity.
but they had all the video cameras.
They had the video cameras, the internet, and of course, the criminals posted everything online too, took pictures.
Blogs,
Yes.
yeah.
What eventually happened to the Aberdeen? Was it torn down after the fire?
There's a story about what happened to the Aberdeen in the book, and it was torn down. If you want to know where it is, those of you who know where W.A. Frost Restaurant is in St. Paul, if you walk out of that, it's on the corner of Western and Selby. If you walk out of that, immediately across the street, and then go from the southwest corner of the block that you're standing on, to the northeast corner of that block at Dayton and Virginia, that's the corner that the paper boy stood on, and it's the corner that the Aberdeen was on. There is a new apartment building named the Aberdeen, and personally, if I had known that the Aberdeen was the site of a grisly torch murder, I don't think I would have named my building the Aberdeen, but they did. And that's on Western, a couple down towards Selby. So, yes?
This might not be a question you can answer without spoiling anything, but what surprised you the most in your book?
I was asked that question, for a newspaper article, and I did answer it there, and I'll answer it the same way again. We all know that race and racism was then and is now an issue that we wrestle with. I really got a sense of how embedded it was in the culture just by the way the investigation was conducted, by the way racism was exhibited. One anonymous writer sent a postcard in and identified a black person as the culprit and said he should be lynched at sunrise. And so there's many examples. And one other I'll mention, and again, I'm not spoiling anything. There were 3 black officers detective and 2 patrolmen on the force at the time that this occurred. They had deep connections in the Rondo community. Ruth had secret relationships in that community that they were never able to unravel. Again, I'm not really spoiling anything. And the white leaders of the investigation never used those black officers as a resource because you didn't pay any attention to black people that they were in service positions. They were maids and porters, and they worked in the slaughterhouses and things like that. And they missed an opportunity to let those people work their community and ferret out information that a black resident would tell a fellow person that they'd never tell a white officer.
Was she Caucasian?
She was white, yes.
How long did the investigation go before it was considered cold? And did anyone ever pick it back up again once it did turn cold?
Cold is a term that was really popularized in the 1970s. There would be periods of time where there were not any files, months and sometimes a year would go by, and then something would come up. So whenever they got a clue, they ran with it and worked on it. And so no one ever declared that the case was cold, and the case is not is considered open. Murder cases are never closed, so the case is still open.
Is anyone else interested in the case in the police force
Again,
now?
I'll be able to answer that question more in 6 months because the case was largely forgotten. And I
Yeah.
think some folks that know about it have never. No one really knew the story. So now the story is out there for people to pick apart and say they can compare their own notes and make their own theories up from this. So I think that there could be some interest.
Well, thanks to you. Good job.
Yeah.
When this goes to film, I think we have a good cast here.
Am I getting murdered?
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Were there any family members, relatives that you were able to interview?
Yes, and one is credited in the acknowledgments, and I'll talk about her, and the other one is not. She was from a family of, I think, 5, and there was only one descendant from that period who was alive. I did talk to him. He was a nephew. She never married. 2 of her siblings never married. And the one that did was, her name was Helen, and Ruth was as close to Helen as she was to anybody. Helen's son is 78, 79, lives in Florida. I contacted him. He said, I don't know anything about the case. We never, ever talked about it. He only had one memory from an article that was published in 1956 that I didn't use in the book because it was extracted from earlier newspaper accounts, and often the accounts were incomplete or in error. They published what they had at the time, and then they found out something else later that made that information not valid. So I didn't pay much attention to that. But that was the only thing that he knew, is that article had come out when he was about 8 years old, and the family was upset by it.
All right.
Anyone else? It looks like we're good. Okay.
All right, terrific. Now the fun part. All right, we head on over and sign some books.
Okay, I'll see you up there.
She wasn't married. That would have explained the murder.
I know.
So which part do you want to play?
Detective, I think.
We've got a volunteer for the.
I have a pretty mild part.
Yeah, you don't last long.
No,
Right,
if at all.
I've always wanted to be a fireman.
Starting your off.
Me and Woody will.
Yeah, I know. So we've been playing a couple of times, maybe 3 times we've been outside. But this week, Monday we were outside. But, today we were inside. So,
Oh, you did?
how about you?
See, no, people say that, but you know, it's still like, really? No, it was like,
It was a good plan.
yeah.
Oh goodness. I'm gonna go say hi to a few people.
Yeah.
Did you wanna go get the book and?
I'm gonna go chat.
Good content. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you. I don't see you probably. There we go.
And it was fun to see the.
Oh my gosh, I'm on camera, hi.
4 minutes, okay.
Yeah, but having done it,
Like, there are people that we listen to a podcast about, he's been to like 30 of them, he goes, you know. And I'm like, no,
They're not that interesting.
Well, my brother took his whole family, and this is the second time. They went to the one that was a couple years ago.
in 2017.
We went to Tucson the Thursday before that, and we didn't, reschedule. Nobody paid attention to the eclipse. The airport. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? And it was like, eclipse travel. We could see it in Tucson better than we could see here.
Yeah, well, it's probably yours.
This is Kathy, that's Barr.
Hi, Joe. Hey,
Hi, too. Hanging in there. Oh yeah, you know, it's not curable. It's just there. I try to make it out. Do what I can. I'm way past all the bitterness and being pissed off about it. I'm just, yeah, whatever. You know, just,
So you're at accept.
yeah. Yeah, been for a while. Are you gonna take Nadine on college visits? Or I'm not gonna be able to do the same stuff for her. I mean, I would like to, but I'm just not. I mean,
Yeah.
it sounds like there's some, they've already got some ideas about local colleges like Metro State and St. Paul College. And
St. Paul College. St. Paul College.
in terms of her, Eve was telling me, the thing is, I think her grades were better than his.
I'm gonna go look at time.
You know that.
I'm gonna go get the
But
other.
there's a lot, we had a bunch of our students at St. Paul College, and they discovered that they give you stipend to live as part of your financial aid. And so it's just kind of like a, you know.
And especially if it's in. So we think that there's enough in the immigrant youth fund, but I was wondering about
On the update.
without even doing any, and then Megan and I are doing it together this summer. Request, you know, sort of fundraising costs.
And if you just spare to let him know what the thing is about your year or something, you know, Chantal refused to let him take the money. And I was trying to tell him how really know about this. You know, if you set up, you know, the college savings plan.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, she puts the money in the 529, you know, and doesn't spend it and you know, and borrows them. And that's what we did with our kids is that we can spend about $10,000 and you can make a couple $1,000 of interest while they're in school. I know, he was looking at me like, she doesn't believe in having debt. Well, good for her. Which means that she's been seeing people being burned by it. Well,
All right, nice to see you. I'm gonna go buy a book.
buy a book.
yeah.